Hello,
Are you back, June?
I am back.
I'm trying to help some people that are needing the passcode and ID. I don't know why they would need that, but so anyway, I put it in there, so hopefully some people will be popping on.
Yeah,
You know,
I had a
you,
difficult time logging in with the link I had, but I used the one from the email and it kind of for a minute seemed like it wasn't going to work, and then here I am. So
I wonder if people are
that's
having
so
a hard
weird.
time. I'm getting a couple of messages, people are like, I need a ID and a passcode. I'm like, they've never needed it before, so I don't know.
Well,
Hopefully
let's
that's
see.
not
Wait,
a
do you have the
problem.
ID and passcode?
I have it, yeah, I
Yeah.
posted it, so hopefully
Yeah.
people can hop on. I know that you're in a time crunch, so I don't want to delay. Um,
Yeah.
we can go ahead and get started here in a minute, and I have some questions for you. And you're in sunny Southern California, are you?
Yep. Yeah, I am.
Nice. All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and introduce you, June, and then I'm sure more people will pop on. And if they can't make it, then we'll have this recording out there for them to view later. But I'm really happy, thrilled that you agreed to be our guest this month, June. You have been the driving force behind the FSHD Society for over a decade, most recently serving as the Senior Director of Research and Education. A visionary leader and passionate advocate, June has played a transformative role in accelerating research, empowering families, and advancing the path toward treatment and cure for FSHD. June has always been a champion for kids and families, continually raising the voice for the early onset. Beyond her work with FSHD, June is a serial social entrepreneur whose career spans biomedicine, patient advocacy, music education, and nonprofit journalism. June brings a lifelong passion for building community, sparking creativity, and making the world a healthier, more equitable place. As she prepares to retire from the FSHD Society this June, we are honored to celebrate her incredible contributions and hear her reflections about past milestones and hear from her what work still needs to be done. And I just want to say, June, on behalf of anybody who's ever had any contact with the FSHD Society, we will miss you so much. We thank you so much for all you've done for us and our families. And for so many people, you were the very first point of contact. I've heard it so many times, like the very first person that reached out to me was June, and she gave me a lifeline and she gave me hope and she made me not feel alone in this journey. So thank you so much, June, and welcome. And thanks for being our guest.
Oh, it's an honor to be here, and thank you for those generous, wonderful words. And I have to say, I feel like being at the society has been one of the greatest gifts that the universe has brought into my life. Um, it's just starting with the amazing people like you, Allie, and Helen, and whoever else is hasn't put on their camera yet, but whoever's listening. Um, it's just a wonderful community, and often in life, like you get out of high school, you get through college, and then you don't meet new people generally. You're kind of like in a little particular social rut. And it's wonderful when something comes along and just breaks open your world and you meet a whole new world of incredible people. And so it's been a gift. It's been, I think all most of us want in life is to have a purpose. And that purpose, is to make the world a better place and to, if even on any given day, sometimes it feels like the hill we're trying to climb is so enormous and the big systemic things we're trying to change are just so daunting. But I always remind myself, like, if I can pick up a phone or answer an email and just make someone's day a little bit better, that was worth it. That's the purpose for being here.
Well, you've done that hundreds of times, June, over the years. But I'm wondering, what inspired you to join the FSHD Society in the first place? And as you mentioned, there are a lot of daunting tasks, and there is that some of the things seem insurmountable. So, what's inspired you and kept you passionate about the FSHD Society's mission over all these years and all the huge tasks that you've undertaken?
Well, it was it was completely accidental that I ended up at the society. I mean, I had done a lot of work in my career as first as a science journalist and then working with a large private foundation developing programs in Alzheimer's disease and so I think somewhere, it's funny when I look back when I was in third grade, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, and then I read some medical journals. I thought this was really boring. Kind of went off in other directions, but somewhere in me, I think that something about the medical field must be calling me, So here I'm back doing things in medicine, and it was just someone who, a headhunter who, reached out or something. I don't even remember exactly, but just with the background. And the founder of the society, Dan Perez, um, liked the fact that he went to Harvard and I went to Harvard, and I think he liked that. I don't know. He just felt it was a branding thing, I don't know, but I don't know if you know the original crimson color of the FSHD Society logo is Harvard crimson. So that was really important to Dan. I don't know. And um, anyway, so it was and he liked that I had this journalism background. So he felt that he felt what the society needed was someone who could communicate the amazing things that were going on. And it was a small organization, but mighty. I mean, Dan was an absolute bulldog. Um, would latch on an issue he felt was important. He would never let go. And I think um, I'm probably that way too, just because of how I am. I mean, I don't know. If I feel like something, if something's right and it should be done, I don't give up. I just keep pushing and prodding and like, well, that didn't work. Well, maybe there's another way to. So I guess in any endeavor, I think that kind of stubbornness and persistence is probably important. And but I heard about this FSH Society, as it was called at the time. I did not know anything about FSHD. I had focused a lot on brain. I knew nothing about muscle. Um, but I looked up the science of, the genetic mechanism, and I thought this is amazing, first of all. The science is just incredible. I'd never heard of a disease mechanism that worked the way FSHD did. And I thought this is treatable. We have this rogue gene that normally isn't active in the adult. And if you can just knock it down, there are lots of ways to do it. And we knew in theory things like mRNA therapies and other things should be able to do it. And I felt in my bones that this could be solved. And I think I really wanted to be part of helping to get a treatment to people who didn't have one. So that was, that's how I ended up. But what Dan didn't quite realize is I also had a lot of nonprofit and foundation experience. I served on some boards of some big national foundations. So that was kind of my training ground for building organizations, for doing strategic plans and so on. So, I mean, that's true with everything. Like, you find interesting challenges. And I feel like, I guess I'm a person, I say like my mantra is if it scares you, do it.
That's great.
You
And
know,
we have been the benefactors of your dogged determination. So thank you. So looking back, like, can you think of like one of the biggest challenges you've had or one of your greatest successes that you're really proud of, and how did you overcome that, and um how do you see like the fruits of that now? I'm sure there's a lot of them, but is there one big one that you can pick out?
I guess one big one, it's kind of funny because I had no idea how it was going to all play out when it first started, but um, back then, I mean, I was still evolving in my own understanding of the role that a patient advocacy organization could play. And I'd actually worked with the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's disease. Uh, and other, like, there's some really forward-thinking organizations for ALS and for multiple sclerosis. So I knew that the whole mindset of what these organizations can do is really shifting. It shifted very dramatically, like through the teens, into, and um, so I felt it was really important to do that. And that a lot of that was, as an advocacy organization, like you really have to connect with all the stakeholders, the researchers, the clinicians, obviously the patients and families, regulators, that you have this role that no one else can play. And one of those is to be this connector and to be this kind of, um, neutral, like our interest is patients, making lives better for people with this condition. And so I just heard, I mean, I think Robbie Tawil and some other clinicians, researchers, Stephen Tapscott and so on, that they were organizing this big conference or workshop on FSHD in the Netherlands. And I was like, oh, if they didn't invite me, well, let me ask them. Like I feel like I should be there. And I think the mindset back then is like they weren't thinking we should make sure patient advocates and are at the table when you organize a meeting like that. It's really different now, right? Like you've been invited to a whole bunch of workshops. 10 years ago, they wouldn't have thought to invite anyone from a patient representative. So I just kind of like, hey, Robbie, like I heard this workshop sounds interesting. Can I, I'd love to go. And so it wasn't like he was against my going. He was like, oh, okay, I didn't even think, so he arranged for me to attend. And it was a workshop that was funded by Chip Wilson, who we all know now. Back then, he had just been diagnosed. He contacted Stephen Tapscott, said, what can I do with this about FSHD? And Stephen, who's a very brilliant, wonderful person, said, you should get all these key people in the field together and start thinking about what do we need to do to speed up the development of therapies. So that was the first workshop. And then the idea was they would reconvene in a couple of years. They'd put together a white paper, put a plan, start to implement it. And but then Chip Wilson got interested in other things. I think he felt like, oh, this is too slow, and like he wanted like a fast solution. He wanted like, I mean, he's a multi-billionaire, and he's like, I just need to find the right thing to put a lot of money into, and we're going to solve this really fast, right? So he stopped. Like they were like, we want to do this other workshop, but we don't. Our funder disappeared. So I said, well, I think this workshop's really important. Let me call Bill Moss in Australia and FSHD Stichting in the Netherlands. Maybe we can each put in some money to fund this next workshop. And fortunately, they did, because at that time, like the society it would have been a big spend for us to finance the whole workshop. But I also felt it was really important to involve these other groups. So the second workshop took place, and they came up with a blueprint for what became the Clinical Trial Research Network. And from other, fields I worked in, and I was talking to people like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which was a huge success in the area of, developing treatments for cystic fibrosis. And I looked at what their playbook, and one of the key things they did was to set up a clinical trial research network. So I said, we need one in our field too, because no one center is going to have enough patients to do natural history studies and clinical trials in a rare disease, right? Like one center might only get 10 people or 20 patients and you're going to need 200, so you have to have a network. You've got to get different centers to work together, have shared standards, operate as a center without walls. And Jeff Statland, who's absolutely brilliant, and I love him to pieces too, understood this and also was putting together this plan. And he had no funding. And he had no one to help him. He didn't, we all know Michaela Walker, right? And before her, he didn't have a Michaela then. He was just doing it all himself. And I'm like, Jeff, you need help. And tell me like what it would cost to pay, an administrator who can help you set up the trial network, because NIH is not going to fund that. MDA is not going to fund that. Like, that's not glamorous. They're going to and I said, we're going to fund this, the linchpin, you need this person, so that's what he did. And and I was talking to the board and I talked to some donors and I said, we're going to need $60,000. I think that was what it was. Maybe it was 100. Anyway, $60,000 to cover this person's salary for the first year and get the network going. And the board, seemed agreeable to the idea, but it was in the middle of the year. They had not budgeted for it. And I said, I'm going to bring in some new money so we can, let's just do it. It's not how I found out later, like that's not usually how you're supposed to do things. But I didn't want to wait till the end of the year and put in a new budget and wait a whole year for this to happen, So I said, let's raise the money and let's do it. So the moment I think the board voted to do it, to okay this, I called the two donors. The money was in the bank like the next day. I called Jeff like, okay, we have the funding for you. So that kind of helped jumpstart the CTRN. And I think that's had a huge role because within a year now the NIH funded I think a $2 million or $4, multi-million-dollar grant. MDA funded a multi-million-dollar infrastructure grant. And they did that because there was now there was a network to fund. And they needed that, the Michaela equivalent, Carly, oh my God, I'm tired of Carly Sims, I think is, anyway, her predecessor. They needed that person to actually like get all the paperwork done and create the legal and, all that stuff, unglamorous. So I'm very, that was a long-winded story, but I just wanted to.
No, that's a good story. So without you, we wouldn't have the CTRN. That's amazing, June. I had
Well,
heard good
it
about
might
that.
have happened. I know Jeff had this idea. I don't want to take sole credit, but I feel like it's all of us like together. Like it might
Right,
have taken him another year or two to get it off the ground,
right,
and just, and as I say, like time is muscle. Like you don't want to wait another year just to go through
right.
the usual budgeting
Well,
process.
well, thank you. I had heard that you were sort of the catalyst behind that, but I didn't know the story. So it's cool to hear how you have these connections that go back, so far with all these, all these folks that have been driving this. I know when I first got involved with the FSHD Society, I was all about the kids and early onset, and you were one of the first people that said, I've been saying this for a while and we need to keep saying it. And you were one of the first people that encouraged me to say that, this needs to be talked about and we need to take care of the kids and the severely affected. I know that that's getting some momentum now, but how do you feel like it started, and where does this, not just necessarily with the early onset, but that's sort of my focus, the early onset and the severely affected, now that we've got so hopefully some drugs in the pipeline coming our way. How do you feel like that trajectory should go? And what unfinished business do we have there? Like, what ideas do you have that we need to tap into to you before you leave to take this forward to the next level?
So that has been a big change in the field too. So for the longest time, when I started, and people used to say like, "There's no hope for rare disease. Like, what company is going to ever fund it?" And then I said, "Well, there's this thing. There are these orphan drug designations, and FDA recognized that these diseases that have very small markets needed an extra boost to make them more attractive to companies. And so they shortened the timeline to, for review. They gave them longer, intellectual property protections. They could make, a lot of things. And it actually had a big impact because a lot of biotechs are now moving in, treating these diseases with sometimes only a few dozen people, affected. And FSHD is big by that, but by that measure. But I think the definition is if you have fewer than maybe 200,000 people affected in the US, that's considered a rare disease. So um, anyway, and the model at that time was that you get a drug on the market, it'll be very expensive because these are, high tech, they are expensive to make. And the company, it still has to spend a lot to develop it, but for a small market. So they would need to charge a lot for these therapies, but the thought was that the insurance companies would pay for it because it was a clear unmet medical need. And what company is going to want the bad newspaper headlines saying, so-and-so company refuses to cover treatment for this kid with this terrible, rare disease. So, and they were getting covered, but now, the whole insurance industry has changed a lot. And it's almost like, right, part of their algorithm to deny coverage for all kinds of things. You hear these horror stories, and I don't know if they're, apocryphal or if they're just, but you hear, it's not a clear playing field. And it was just really only a couple years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, that we suddenly realized because like treatments were being denied to people with SMA, for example, and the SMA therapies were on the market. And it's because they they weren't the same kind of patients that were in the clinical trial. So the company could say, there's no data that if you're in a wheelchair, this is going to work for you because the trial was done in people who were not in wheelchairs. They could use that to prevent people from getting access to treatment. And we know in the case of FSHD, like it is the same condition, same genetics, same DEX4 doing its bad thing. And it's progressive across the lifespan. It's not like you land in a wheelchair and now suddenly you're stable. You continue to progress, and it's going to impact your quality of life in all kinds of ways. And so, so there was a little bit of complacency before because the idea was you got to get it on the market and then everybody will have access. And we truly believe that. And I think that was essentially, reasonable thing to believe until about 3, 4, 5 years ago. And now we know that that's changed. And so it's super important now to do trials in a more diverse population, which is challenging because you're trying to show the effect of a drug that might be very small you only have 6 months or a year to measure it. And so you have to kind of handpick a population that you think will show an effect, like that otherwise they would have progressed, but they're not going to progress during that short time frame. And you also have a very limited number of validated tools to measure, muscle function. So, so we have a lot of work to do to design trials that allow for bigger, more diverse patient population, for tools that can accommodate and measure disease progression across a wide range of functions and a wide range of severities. So that is the scientific challenge. And at the same time, also, the companies are, they're risking hundreds of millions of dollars. So they're trying to minimize their risk. So, we have to think about what can we do to make them, to minimize the risk for them. I don't have easy solutions for that, but there might be, we talk about expanded access, that you give it to people who don't fit the trial criteria. You treat it like a trial. You have to measure like their outcomes. You know, you want to make sure there are no adverse effects, but you don't mix that data with the clinical trial itself. You know, you keep it separate, but you analyze it and, you know, and use that data if you can later. But you can mitigate, you know, like you're not necessarily risking the trial, but you also have to recognize that each person enrolled in a trial takes up a huge amount of resources. You know, it's probably over $1 million per trial participant in terms of, you know, maybe you need to screen 5 to get the one. So you have and if you've been through screening, it's like often a 2-day process involving dozens of nurses and technicians and physical therapists and the neurologist. And, you know, you start to add all that up, plus all the equipment that's used that has to be calibrated and maintained, and, you know, make sure that from one person to the next, it's measuring everything exactly the same way. And the data is all collected and somebody's looking at the data. So huge teams are involved. So it's a significant financial commitment for companies to just add more people to the trial, you know. So, you know, as a community, I think we need to think about, you know, how do we, you know, like I personally believe that data is going to be really valuable to them, but they have to convince their CEO and their shareholders that, you know, um, so, you know, there are a lot of smart people in this field. I think, you know, I just hope, you know, that people can come up with more creative ways of designing trials, to mitigate risk for companies and produce the results we want for the community. And the only way we're going to get there is by making noise. And, you know,
Right.
yeah.
And you know, a large part of your job, like you're doing right now, is educating folks, kind of breaking down a very complicated process so that we can understand, if we're not in this world all the time, how all that works. How important do you think it is for families and, you know, parents of young kids, or even if you're a patient yourself, to understand, you know, how clinical trials work, what the science is behind FSHD? How important is it for them to understand that? And then how do they take that understanding to better advocate for themselves or their children?
I think it's very important. I'm not saying that everybody should, or, you know, not everybody wants to know all of this stuff, but if you want to be an effective advocate, I think it's really essential to understand it as well as you can. Because I guess the simple way to put it is, if you want answers, you need to ask the right question. And if you don't know the question to ask, you're not going to get the answer you're driving towards, you know.
Right.
So, so you need to, I think it's important to approach the companies. I mean, yes, they have their own agenda and their own priorities, but there are also partners. And at a personal level, I think, you know, everyone I've ever met working in companies, they're doing it because they want to find a cure. They want to find, you know, they really believe in that. And so you need to approach them not as an antagonist, but as someone who wants the same thing you do, just maybe through a somewhat different path. Maybe they have a little bit more myopia about it. Maybe they don't fully understand what it means for the patient, and you can educate them and bring them on board. Um, and you know, and maybe, I mean, it's, you know, it takes some level of diplomacy, I suppose, and and but you know, always like, it's so important to keep your eyes on the prize, you know,
Well,
and
I don't want
yeah.
to, you know, does anybody else have any questions for June? I can keep fire no matter all night, but does anybody else have anything that they would like to ask June or say to June? Will we have her undivided attention?
Well, actually, I've got a question or comment, I guess. I hear and read from some people, they think that pharmaceutical companies are just big profit makers, and that just makes my, it kind of makes my blood boil because I realize not just from FSHD, but we've got other conditions in our family, larger family. And so I get information sent, emailed and PO letters and there's several things, and it takes years to develop some of these drug therapies and everything. And it just really, like how do we counter that attitude where people think, and then there's a sort of political overtone as well, because they think we shouldn't be spending money on health research, and drug companies are just making big money, and they're not, and I think the profits are being rolled in. They need those profits. They need to make a bit of money when they sell the drug to cover ongoing research. How do we advocate better in our sphere of influence? Because it does make a difference in terms of people's choices when they go to the voting booth and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard because I don't think it's impossible. I think education, relentlessly like educating about it is incredibly important. And I will say, of course, for-profit pharmaceutical companies are in it to make a lot of money. Somebody wants to make money in there, but they've chosen to do it by delivering um, therapies and diagnostics. And the failure rate is huge. And it's really complicated. And it's not just because a drug doesn't work. If it doesn't work, it doesn't deserve to succeed and it should be set aside right away. But there are a lot of things that probably do work, but you just couldn't do those science rigorously enough to pass all the hoops, the regulatory hoops and so on. And so, I mean, I often say, developing drugs is not for the faint of heart. I mean, if you met the people who work in these companies, they work so hard. From the bench scientists all the way up through, but there are people who they're giving up their weekends and their nights, and they are working incredibly hard. Um, they have, there's so many regulations that they need to follow, that they just have a whole team of people just to make sure they're complying with all the regulations, which are not there to make life difficult or slow things down for people. They're there to make sure that the public is safe, right? Because it's, all too easy if you didn't have that to put something on the market that's going to kill people or give them cancer or what, who knows what. So and it's very complicated. Like you have to, like you're making a new drug. Well, where's that drug going to come from? It's got to be synthesized in a laboratory. If it's an mRNA, you need a whole bio kind of, engine. I don't even, you need a factory that makes this stuff that's extremely sophisticated scientifically, like molecularly, design. It's got to be exactly right. It can't have any impurities. It can't have any, all that stuff. So it's super complex, even just to make the compound before you even put it in a person. And you have to prove that you follow what's called good manufacturing practice. You have to prove that you can make enough of it so that if your drug ever succeeds, you will have enough to treat the people who need to be treated, because the regulators don't want to approve a drug that all of a sudden you can only treat 100 people and there's 10,000 people that need it. So all of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, the public never knows about. I mean, I don't know the most of it myself. I just have some, read a little here, talked about it, like, whoa, it is one of the most complex undertakings. I mean, we have, it's like every drug that succeeds is like putting someone on the moon several times over. So I think people need to understand that. I mean, there's a certain level of skepticism. I mean, companies, there's so many people in them. There are scientists, there are doctors, there's also business people, there are marketing people, and we all have heard the stories of, less than ethical practices around, some of these things, like the way, things are marketed and so on. And I think it's unfortunate because it does erode the public's trust in the whole enterprise. But, you just have to take the take the good with the bad, or the bad with the good, I don't know. But on the whole, I mean, and we at the society, we get to know these companies really well. And that's been a great thing, because the worst thing is if a company goes off and does an FSHD program and never talks to a patient advocacy organization, and they design a trial that nobody wants to be a part of for all kinds because they didn't take into consideration the patient's point of view. And they don't know patients, so they jump up, they go like, we got this therapy, and they're like, who are you? Like, what is this thing? We want to make sure that the companies, that if we're going to like help recruit patients for a particular clinical trial or something like that, they have to pass muster with us in terms of, like, we don't have an opinion about is it going to work or not, because nobody knows. That's what the trial is for. But do they pass muster in terms of how they deal with us, how they deal with patients, how they, transparency and their ethics and, all that stuff. And I'm just a couple of apocryphal, well, they're not apocryphal, there's stories that I think might be illustrative. But at the end of the day, if you're going to do some research and you actually want to make a difference in people's lives, you have to do all this hard work to get it in the clinic. So you might have this incredible diagnostic tool, for example, you can diagnose FSHD. But if you don't publish that work and work with the labs that can actually commercialize it, even if, I mean, when I say commercialize, you could run it as a nonprofit, but you have to get it to the clinical grade. You have to be able to train other people to run that test. You have to scale it so that it can serve, tens of thousands of patients. And if you don't do that work, you're really limited in the impact you're able to have, and I think people can sometimes be a little naive. They can be very idealistic. I totally understand that. I mean, there was, I think we all know there was a company that was started by groups of patients, and they were determined to raise money from patients because they wanted to make sure that the drug at the end of the day was going to be affordable by patients. And they felt the only way they can control that is if patients controlled the process all along the way. But there was no way that a group of, patients through their donations were going to fund, come up with $100 million for one company that, and your shot, the chance of success is like 1 in 10. So, I mean, I totally sympathized and understood why they wanted to do this, but it felt, I felt like, that is not how I would invest patients' dollars in something that's that risky when what you need to do is build the infrastructure that makes sure as many drugs as possible can make that journey as quickly as possible and be successful. But, so I think, there were lessons learned there, I guess. And I think, as I was saying, I think it was very idealistic, but also in a funny way, very naive about how the business works. And so, you know, they're just, different outcomes. And I feel like, what the society tries to do is because we have people with a lot of experience in this area. So I think we try to like apply that to be as strategic as possible in what we feel is kind of pretty, as we're trying to be as well informed as we can about the whole ecosystem, how the pharma industry works, how the diagnostics industry works, what's required to get through regulation, what the insurance companies are doing. It's threading a lot of needles.
And speaking of that, you've invested, over 10 years of your life in this, and you're leaving at a time when, we thought Fulcrum was going to get over the finish line, and it just didn't. Just speaks to a lot of this stuff does fail. So what, as you're leaving, what is your hope for the role of the FSHD Society going forward?
Well, I think it's to continue. Right now, we're investing a lot in bringing people together to get those tools that are needed for different clinical trials. We're looking at imaging because now you can see like how muscle changes over 6 months or a year, and it doesn't matter if it's in your arm or in your back or in your leg. So you're not locked to one kind of, we can only measure legs or we can only measure upper body. So I think that's a really important area to try to, push forward scientifically. We're still looking for, that blood test. So, anywhere in your body, a muscle is affected, your blood, something will show up in your blood and we can measure that. And we're, we're looking and we're also trying to think about how do we encourage more adaptive clinical trial design so that we can include children and non-ambulatory. So I certainly hope the society continues to really push into that. And a lot of it is like the society that doesn't do research itself. It funds research and it's an advocate within the research community. So, and I've seen this happen a lot where, we talk to the researchers and at first they're like skeptical, like, oh, da, da, da. And then we say, well, think about it, or let's think about this way, that, and people will budge and, you bring more creativity or different ideas into the field. And I hope the society, will continue in that role. And we are dialoguing with the FDA. So when the next drug that comes before them, hopefully for a approval to go on the market, that they're, the FDA is well educated about FSHD and why this therapy matters and why the outcomes are meaningful. So there will be, that's also an ongoing thing. I think we needed to do a check-in with FDA probably, maybe every year or every couple of years. So, I hope they don't all leave. I don't know what to say,
Right.
but, and then going beyond that, we're starting to say, we need a strategy to educate clinicians, right? Like it's really hard to find doctors who know anything about FSHD. Well, what can we do about that? That's one of the biggest mountains we're trying to climb. because, there's thousands of rare diseases out there, and it's not realistic to expect doctors to know all of them and to be able to diagnose people, but we can try, we can make noise, we can raise awareness, we can do clinician education. We're working on care guideline. So, so that's going to continue. And I know Ashley Ferreira, who's the director of education, will be taking on a lot of the educational stuff, including leaning into the clinician education. So, we'll see more of that. And we're also starting to deal with the insurance companies, not directly yet, but there's a whole process by which it's hard for insurers to turn down treatments that are part of a standard of care, right? So there's a process to trying to get things to be standard care. There's a little murkiness around it, but we'd want to probably partner with the American Academy of Neurology. They have a certain process that kind of puts a stamp of, approval, like every patient with this condition should get this, this, and this, and it should be covered by insurance. So, and then, one of the things we've also done is really, it always bothered me. We're here in the US, and we forget we're like a tiny fraction of the world population. So what about everybody else in the world with FSHD? And so, we want to make sure that, as much as possible, that they're not there by themselves, that they're not alone. So there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, you're leaving us. So I know you have to get going here pretty soon. You have somewhere to be, but I don't know if you want to talk about what's next for you, or if you had one message that you could give to every person in the FSHD community, if you could talk to everybody at one time, since you have so much background and knowledge and worked in this for so long, what would that message be?
I think the message is that we are so powerful if we work together. You might have felt through your life, you got this diagnosis and you're all alone with it and there's nothing you can do. That's kind of the message that's been, but I think the society and the people who make it up are living proof that when you join together, you come out of your isolation, everybody has something that they can contribute, some talent. It's just their voice, their story, or, if you're an incredible accountant, we can always use more accountants. Or, there are people with incredible talents, and some of them wait till they retire and they're like, well, by the way, I'm a healthcare lawyer. Like, oh, where have you been all our life? We've been needed someone like you to help us figure out the legal strategy here for this or that. And, so, but I think where we've gotten, it's just, just what more proof do you need? I mean, we have all these drugs in the market and people working this global alliances and big network. And so that's my message. And it's the same one I carry it with. I started a newspaper in my city because local journalism is dying, and it's a crisis in our society that people don't know what's going on in their own town hall. And so, and it's largely volunteer driven, we've raised some money, but it's like there are a lot of people who are feeling the same way, and the power of just speaking up and saying, like, let's all gather together. And like, oh, you have a marketing background. Okay, we're going to create a marketing team. And this is, and you like to do fundraising, and bless you, like you're like, or dozens of copy editors and photographers and people. I mean, just, they came out of the woodwork, and it's like just finding a way to like point everybody in the same direction and finding a place in the machine to where they can push and make a difference is that's what it's all about. And that's what the society has done. That's what all of you here, I know you're all very active. Michelle, by the way, big shout out. Hello. I saw Michelle. Oh my gosh, look at how long your hair is. Um,
June, I have one question for you. You've seen it through from the beginning to the end. You were the first voice I talked to. You continue to be the voice I talk to. Did you ever think back in the early days? I mean, even when Kate was diagnosed like 7 years ago, and we had what Acceleron was the only one in the marketplace. Did you ever think that you would see this type of activity back then when you reflect back?
um, you know, I don't know, because I think if I had imagined it too strongly, I might have like, no way, like I might have given up. Like that's too. I mean, you kind of, but I think that's where I wanted to see things go. And I think the trick is like, every day you think of one step that you can take that will move you in that direction. You can't be too greedy and want to do it all like in one big bound. Like you
I
gotta
think
like,
that is a huge, powerful message in itself, is that one step, because I think that's one thing Allie and I've learned through the years is, our impatience grows on us daily, but then we have to remember where you start and where you came from. But you've seen it all, right? You started just, you were the only drum beat.
well, I wouldn't say that. No, I mean, we had an amazing board.
Oh
We had a
yeah.
lot of people, but yeah, but
You kept it alive. You were
I
you were
like,
keeping it going.
yeah. Um, and I would say, I tell my colleagues at the society all the time, like talk talk to people every day, because first of all, that's the only way you're going to know what's really happening or
Mhm.
how people are feeling. You can, theorize and imagine all things, but you just talk to people. It's always humbling, and you always are richer for it. And also, it's that feeling of like, if you can just make a little difference in someone's life, like that, I've got, Kristen emailed and I've got to talk to her. I've got to talk to her right away. She's this mom who's just gotten this devastating diagnosis. Um, and you just, so I mean, when I started, I had this big checklist, like we need a health economic study and we need to do this, we need this. And I'm like, how are we ever going to get there? And I don't, I wasn't thinking that day by day, but I guess it was somewhere in here. And now I look back and I'm like, wow.
You did it. You did it.
Well, no, I mean, with a lot of people, but, and I hope that my colleagues who will carry on after me will kind of keep talking, keep in touch, because sometimes as an organization grows, you can sometimes just be in your own, like, tower sometimes, but it's so important to keep talking to the community and keep learning from the community. So, and I hope it's not goodbye. I think it's just another phase, but I hope to stay in touch with all of you in the next phase of my my journey.
What is the next phase, June?
I'm going to run a newspaper. That's that's my retirement activity. Going back to my first
And
love in journalism.
what's the focus of the newspaper?
It's for the city of Waltham. It's a city paper.
Love it. All right, well done.
Thank you.
It's for the
It's
city of what? Of which?
Waltham, that's where I live. Yeah, we
Yeah.
lost our newspaper about 10 years ago, like many, many communities. And really, it was kind of a little selfish. Like I was like, I have no idea what's going on in my town and at elections. I have no idea who these people are running for or what the issues are. And you Google it and there's nothing, nobody's reporting on any of it. So that's a problem. And then I thought, I think I know how to fix it. So
Ah. So how did you come to, had you sort of set in mind that at a certain year you would retire, or how did you come to this?
well, I was hoping that by now the Fulcrum drug would be on the market. I'd say like, we got this across the finish line. So I was pretty peeved when they I mean, it was devastating news, but also at a personal level, I was like, I'm gonna call up, Alex Saber and tell him they can't do this because I was gonna retire when it got on the market. But it seemed like a good time. I feel like the society's really in good hands, and there's some wonderful people working there, and
Well,
yeah,
we also know you're not going anywhere. You're going to keep your eye on it. So
I will, yes.
or Allie will keep you informed and pull you back
Yes.
in when need be.
June's
So
gonna delete my
I-
number from her contact list when she's
yes,
retired.
totally. And I would love to, we should do this again. We don't, but I do have to leave right now. I've got to go. My husband has got to go
Yeah.
somewhere and I've got to go with him. So
Well, June, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And from everybody in the whole FSHD community, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you for everything you've done.
oh,
You really have brought a lot of people to the society, and you kept us here. You,
Mhm.
June, have done a lot of this, and anytime I texted you or called you, I know it's not just me, it's a lot, and you always made time for us, and I know you've given so much, and we just want to really thank you from the bottom.
oh, well, I want to thank all of you, and I know that you will be that person for the next person, all of you. I mean, I know you do that and you talk to people and you are that anchor that, in the storm for new people, other people who are coming into the community. So I thank you for that.
Well, thank you, June. We're gonna let you go. And
Okay, I better run.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get
All right,
divorced.
thank you so much.
Okay.
See you, June.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
June.
Thank you, June.
Thank you.